All right, so welcome to this webinar from the Ghent Work Group. My name's Steve Carter. I'm sharing this presentation with Leland Plutnik from ESCO. We both are co-chairs of the Ghent Work Group Packaging Subcommittee and also members of the ISO TC130 Work Group 2. And we're going to talk to you today about the processing steps standards that began in the Ghent Work Group and has now worked its way through the ISO process and is out for approval worldwide. So go ahead, Leland, to the next slide. So just a quick introduction of who we are. This picture was taken in Ghent a little over, I guess this was 2 years ago now. So we're an international organization made up of many different types of graphic users, association developers, companies that sell stuff into the graphic arts industry, as well as consultants and education. So there's a lot of members like education, like we said, vendors. We have different industry type members, which are not just pre-press or print providers, but also consultants to the industry, as well as associations spread across the globe. Next slide. So just a quick, for those who are not familiar with the Ghent Work Group, the Ghent Work Group was formed actually more than 15 years ago, but the packaging committee is about 15 years old now. We've been working on different types of best practices and specifications for the use of PDF and lots of print and media uses for many years. One of the things that we focus on is creating hands-on user experiences that they can take and use in your own companies. So we do the testing, reviewing, documenting. We have regular meetings, roughly 3 a year now, and our goal is to educate the industries to become better at using PDFs in whatever work they do for the graphic arts industry. Next slide. So as we said, our mission really is to develop and maintain these process specifications for the graphic arts workflow, as well as promote them. And we're trying to do a better job, obviously, with this webinar to help promote them, because sometimes we find the work that we do in the Ghent Work Group is one of the best kept secrets, and not that many people know about it. So this is an effort to try to help people understand better what's going on in these work groups. Next slide. So one of the questions we get a lot of times is, what do we need the Ghent Work Group for? We're finding that more and more of us are working across the globe. It's not just in our region or even in our country anymore. Many requirements are being communicated out about color and other different things, especially in the packaging industry. Users and brand owners are getting confused. Vendors are trying to figure out how do they meet the demand, and is this a one-off, or is it going to be adopted by the industry as a whole? And then how soon will it be adopted? If the vendors do adopt it, will they be able to sell it or recoup the cost of developing? We're being asked to be able to send files and talk in a blind manner, so meaning that I want to be able to send a PDF that contains everything that is needed for that printer or converter or whoever to use that PDF in the manufacturing process. We hear a lot that there's too much time spent changing, pre-flighting, fixing, redoing files between the different supply chain partners, so which causes a lot of duplication of efforts. People are redoing the same things that was done, before, and thus we came to a need or a realization that we need a better set of best practices and common guidelines to help drive this blind exchange, as we mentioned before. Next slide. So the Ghent Work Group is made up of multiple subcommittees. Today, Leland and I are representing the packaging subcommittee, but you can see there's lots of different subcommittees that are working on different things. One of the ones that's probably been seen or heard of from the most is the specifications committee. If you use any of the major pre-flight tools in the industry, such as PitStop or Callus PDF Toolbox, some of the other ones, or even inside of companies such as Kodak and AGFA and others, those specifications that they use for a lot of the pre-flight settings come from this committee. There's also one that works with the color, that works on helping document what we do. The marketing committee is what helped put this webinar on. And the compliance testing is a set of patches and control things that can be used by vendors and other suppliers in the industry to make sure that what the tools they're using actually are compliant with the specifications that were set. So again, this is just an idea of what that is, and feel free to go to the Ghent Work Group's website and learn more about each subcommittee. Next. So let's talk about a little bit about what's been going on with the packaging subcommittee. In the beginning, we started when PDF 1.6 came out. It was the first version of PDF that allowed for transparency and other use cases where it was beyond a CMYK in a more practical use case. So we started building profiles and specifications that could be used in pre-flighting. And at that time, we concentrated on offset, gravure, and flexo because they have slightly different needs and requirements. So these were implemented probably 2010, roughly 2011 was when they first started being published. The last one that has been worked on is a set of PDF or specifications for packages that were based on the overall Ghent Work Group's package or specification from 2015. Now there's still some work in the subcommittees to bring those up to even more use case, but the ones that are published and out on the website are based on the GWG 2015, which is fairly current as far as the level of PDF that's been going. The PDFX4 standard has been out and being used widely, primarily in the magazine and newsprint and catalog world, but it's also fairly well adopted now in the packaging industry. So next slide, Lee. So one of the things that Lieven and I and others of the subcommittee have been working on is there was a big need to be able to take parts of a package that need to be viewed, but typically aren't always on the printed package, such as the die or the embossing or the varnish that needs to be shown, but it usually comes across as either a clear gloss or a clear matte, doesn't affect the color, and some of the other things that are typically used. So in the processing steps, we've been making, I think there's some text here, Lee, even if you want to hit the next. So one of the things that we've been working on is how do we take this data and standardize a way for it to be used and seen so that whether a human is looking at it or a machine is using it, it's in a way that can be consistent and reliable. So inside of the Ghent Work Group, we started with a outline or a description of the problem we were trying to solve, and wrote up Lieven and a few others, myself included, wrote up a very specific use case and presented it to the ISO TC130 Work Group 2 to see if it would be accepted as a work group item to turn into an international standard. And that was accepted, and Lieven, bless his heart, has been working for the last 3+ years to work through all of the red tape inside of ISO to get this to be published. So the ISO specification 19593-1 has actually been approved and is out for approval by the international standard bodies worldwide right now. So we hope to get that back sometime this year, hopefully in the next 6 months, so that it could be published and ready to roll. So next, Lieven. So one of the things that's key about this is it doesn't do us a lot of good to have a specification that just sits on a shelf or on a bunch of paper. So one of the things that Lieven and I and the Ghent Work Group has been working on is evangelizing and getting many of the vendors to support this this new specification. And we're happy to tell you that there's a lot of the industry that's looking to adopt, and this list is growing monthly. There's quite a few companies that are looking how to use this in their workflow tools. Next slide.
Shall I take over here, Steve?
I think so.
Okay, so like Steve has said, we have been this has been quite a journey from the Ghent Work Group, defining the requirements and the outlines of a solution towards real international standards in ISO. Like Steve pointed out, since December, we have entered the final stage. So 19593-1 is now FDIS, Final Draft International Standard. And actually, if you're really interested, you can already buy the draft version from ISO at their website. The final really published standard is expected someday soon in the first half of this year, hopefully. So, like Steve already pointed out, it's about standardizing the way of adding data that is not intended for printing inside the PDF. So what is it actually? Well, a PDF is a page description language. So basically, these processing steps contain ordinary PDF objects, PDF paths, and text objects. They are not used in the final production printing, but they are sometimes printed on proofs, and they represent, in most cases, additional finishing steps that need to happen to the printed sheet to turn it into the final printed product, like a box, a label, a corrugated box, display, and so on. And this is actually not a new problem. It's common practice in the packaging, labels, and sign and display industry to do this already for many, many years, even before PDF existed. It worked, and the mechanism that it was using was making sure that these PDF path and text objects are using spot colors that are not used in the final print production. And then based on either name conventions or proprietary vendor-specific metadata, the consumer of such a PDF could distinguish the real printing content from these additional types of data. I said this is common practice in the packaging and labels industry, but very soon in the discussions in Ghent Work Group and ISO, it was also quickly realized that it's not exclusively limited to the packaging or label industry. In other printing segments of the printing industry, similar techniques are being used. So what's the problem actually with the current practice? That is that it relies on naming conventions that are ad hoc agreed upon between the sender and the receiver of the PDF. And that poses several problems. It's error prone. If a receiver gets a file from a sender that it is not used to dealing with, it might mistake one of these extra separations that were meant to represent, for instance, the die cut. It could misinterpret those and put them really on the printed product, which would be bad. So it relies. It's error prone, and it also requires extra configuration setups or manual interventions to get it right. So it's cumbersome to automate handling, and it's error prone. What kind of types of processing steps do we distinguish? There are a number of larger categories that are subdivided into very specific types of processing steps, but let's stick to the large categories. I think the main one that comes to mind for many people are the structural processing steps. Sometimes these are called CAD lines, die lines, cut lines, you name it. What do they represent? They actually represent how the packaging products, which is basically a 3D physical object, will be produced from a flat substrate. It corresponds with production steps in finishing, typically cutting, folding, gluing, embossing, and so on. For production steps in finishing, that can be or that are applicable for many types of packaging products, and in many cases, the originator of those CAD lines are specialized structural design applications. A second type of processing step is Braille. So text for the visually impaired people. These can be applied during finishing, can be a die cutter or on the folder gluer, or it could also be applied on an inkjet using UV hardening inks. So when I said in the beginning, processing steps represent things that happen to the packaging product that is not the actual printing, has to be taken with a grain of salt. Some of these extra processing steps can actually also apply a printing technology, like for instance here for Braille. A third type of processing step is the legend. Legends are informational panels with the design identification, customer info, technical details, and these are always positioned outside of the die line so that they don't overlap with the actual print content. The fourth one is dimensions, a collection of indications, arrows, numbers, and units indicating sizes of physical items in the design for the human reviewer. Positions, which are indications of intended or allowed or forbidden positions for text, barcodes, and hologram. So it's actually indicating the position where, for instance, a hologram has to be glued on the box after the printing. The white, backing white when printing happens on transparent foil or metallic surfaces. These data are usually embedded inside the PDF with a special false color so that a human reviewer can actually see where the white is. And the same is true for the varnish. The varnish is usually also embedded in the PDF using false color so that it's obvious for the human reviewer where those varnish, where the varnish is actually covering the design. So, but why? Why in God's name do people want to store processing steps in PDF if it's not about the printing? PDF is a printing format after all. Well, the idea here is in the packaging industry to use the PDF as the production master for both printing and non-printing operations. And who's the user for that? Well, to start with, of course, there's the graphic designer. Without the information about the die lines, the graphic designer has no way to know how to correctly position the graphic elements in relation to that structure. So here it's supporting the graphic design in doing the right thing. The other use case for that is the quality control and approval. When the die is included in the PDF, the quality control can actually see that the die that the graphics are designed versus the correct die. They can check that graphics are placed correctly in relation to that die. For instance, that a barcode is not too close to a folding line or a cut line. To enable non-visually impaired people to do quality checks on Braille, and the legends and the dimensions give extra context for the visual checks that a quality control or approval person needs to do. That's more. I mean, those things are, I would say, quite obvious, but there's more. The fact that the actual die contour is embedded in the PDF enables layouts and tool manufacturing tools to build the layouts so the step and repeats correctly. And last but not least, more and more we see the also introduction of digital machines in the finishing part of the production flow. And when the production master, the PDF contains both the printing and the non-printing data, PDF can be used to drive these digital finishing machines, be it cutting tables for sample making or short run production, digital laser cutter machines, or digital folding carton finishing equipment. How are processing steps stored in a PDF? And instead of just showing slides, I will switch to demo mode in a way. But let me give you. I don't want to overwhelm you with PDF technical stuff, but I will stick to the principles, the concepts that were used to build the ISO 19593-1 standard. Metadata is the first key concept. The processing steps objects are collected by type in a PDF, and I'm using PDF terminology, optional content groups. For the mere mortals among us, you can think of optional content groups as in PDF as being layers in your favorite application. And there is, like I already said, there is one optional content group per processing type. I will make this more tangible when we look at the sample files and we go through the demo. That's nothing new. I mean, that's not typical for processing steps. That could have been done in the past just as well. And what is also is not changed compared to the previous situation is that name of the optional content group can be user defined, can be localized, because it's presentation layer. People really see it in the UI of Acrobat or any of the other applications. It's in many cases localized in the language of the user. For Oriental people, the name of the layer might be a Chinese name, a Japanese name, or Korean, or whatever. For a US or UK based user that needs to approve the PDF, the layer names could be just in plain English. Where ISO 19593 really comes in is that attached to those layers, optional content groups that collect processing step objects by type, there is an optional content group dictionary, a piece of metadata attached to the layer. And that piece of metadata uses standardized terminology which won't change from one part of the world to another part. That the metadata there, of course, is not directly meant for human interpretation. It's used for to let the PDF generating applications indicating the type of the processing step, and let a consumer of that PDF identify that particular layer as containing PDF objects corresponding with that processing step based on that fixed vocabulary. And the second concept where ISO 19593 builds upon is what I call non-interaction. What do I mean by that? That is that when you insert objects in that correspond to, let's say, a finishing operation like cutting into a PDF, you want to have a guarantee that those inserted objects for cutting do not influence the printing separations. You would not want to have your printing separations knocked out by the die contour. So there has to be a guarantee when you switch on or off that optional content group for cutting processing step, that the printing separations remain unchanged. For the ones, for the most common types of processing steps, that means that the objects are limited in the PDF constructs that you can use to color them. For instance, one of the rules there says that the processing steps for cutting need to have a stroke with a spot color that is not used as a printing separation. It has to be in blend mode normal, and it has to be in overprint. That guarantees that cutting contour will not interact with the actual printing separations. For those that are ESCO users or acquainted with ESCO applications, they will quickly recognize that that means that this is compatible with the technical in concept in ESCO applications or in applications that use something similar from other vendors. So let's switch to demo mode. Okay. I have a file here, which we can have a quick look at it. This is one of, or based on one of the sample files that was made for the Ghent work group and for ISO by Phototype. So it's one of the sample files that go with the standard. But currently we are not well. Currently there are no processing steps yet. In the application, you see layers. And I see layer names like like the one over here. It's called Sneden. For the Dutch people in the audience, they will recognize this as being the same as cutting, and you can see that it actually corresponds with the cut contour. And there's another one called Rillen, which will add actually the crease lines to it. Okay, not really exciting, but I have a workflow here on my server, which I can use to turn this into a file that is using processing steps. Let's launch that workflow. We'll let it run for a while. Okay, and now we have taken. Let's look at the output of this workflow. This workflow tried, based on those Dutch layer names, to associate the layer names with processing steps. So that's like a way to turn a legacy, if you want, PDF without processing steps into a file with processing steps. Pitstop here tried to do that, but Pitstop is coming with a warning. So let's look at the Pitstop report, and the report has done many fixes, but there are a couple of errors here that show problems. Let's see what those problems actually are. So there are, what it's saying is that in the positions group, and that's one of the processing steps, there are objects that have a blend mode other than normal. And if I look at the highlighting that Pitstop gives us for the where the object is located that is offending that rule, it's right over there. And there is a second warning here, or error message from Pitstop, saying that the positions processing step contains objects that are not set in overprint. And again, it's showing that particular or highlighting that particular object there in the design. Okay, we need to fix this. I can do that by opening up the design file in my favorite application. Let's do it this way. I'm going to open it up in ArtPro+. A couple of things you have to see here now is that we had those Dutch layer names, but now you see that ArtPro+ in this panel here on the right actually is associating the layer names with the standardized vocabulary from the processing steps, so from the ISO standard. For instance, you see here that the Sneden layer now is identified as the cut processing step. By the way, there is a whole list here of all the potential processing steps that you can associate with a layer in ArtPro+. ArtPro+ also does an on-the-fly pre-flight of the ISO rules for this particular design. So I actually get the same in the message center. I get the same warnings over here saying that there is a processing step object that should be an overprinting, but that is not an overprinting. And the same, there is an object with a custom transparency, while it should be overprint. Let's see where that object is. I see that the object selected is right there. So it's that particular rectangle, and I can easily fix that. I go to my panel. I'm setting the object to overprint my first message is disappearing, so that's already one problem solved. And I see also that the object here is in blend mode darken. I can switch that to normal, and all my warnings for or my errors against the ISO 19593 standard are gone. Let's save the file. Corrections are done, and I can let my workflow continue. And now my workflow will check again the end results against using PitStop against the processing steps standard. And now I get a green tick mark, which means that my corrections were actually done. So what I demonstrated over here is a workflow in an automation engine that allows to take design using plain vanilla layers, using PitStop pre-flight profiles. We can turn that into a file that complies with the ISO 19593 standard, and we can also verify. Just use it as a verify action instead of turning into that an incoming file using processing steps is actually compliant with the standard. But that's not all, of course. That's about turning a file that does not use processing steps into a file that uses processing steps, or verifying that a file that uses processing steps is compliant to the ISO standard. But what use is that for me? Well, let's look at a couple of examples, let's start a new workflow, and I'm going to use a workflow that just checks the X height of text by making use of cutting processing steps. Let's do that. We'll let PitStop do its work. And again, I get an action item. We can go and look at the preview report. So the PitStop pre-flight report is now telling me that the X height is less than the required of some text in the file is less than the required 0.7 millimeters. Let's see where that text is. So you see the text highlighted over there. Let's zoom in a bit. So you see it's highlighting this very small 2-point text, while saying that this is less than the X height that is required for this particular design. The interesting thing about this is that if we just scroll a bit to another location in this file, you have exactly the same text over there. The file, the 2-point text that was located inside the die line was flagged as being as a problem, while the text that was outside of the die line was not flagged as a problem. So that's quite interesting, because if it would flag this as a problem, we actually have a false alarm. It's only the text that is inside the die contour that is really important. Now, the interesting thing is that we can have a look at the PitStop profile that actually does that. And if I go through my let the profile editor start first. Okay, so this was the profile I was using. So the select action to find what was actually the die line, so the cutting contour, was not using any ad hoc colorant names or any other methods or special trick to find the die line. It simply uses the select layer by specific processing step, and in this case we select the processing step with group the processing step which belongs to the group structural and with type cutting, and we use that to select all the objects with inside that contour, and it's only on those objects inside the die contour that we do the check on the X height. So the processing steps allow you to identify the cutting contour unambiguously, independent of naming of layers or colorants, and that can be used then to refine the selection criteria for doing pre-flight checks. So that's one particular case of that shows the usefulness of the processing steps. Another workflow and use case I can also demonstrate is that we can split the file in its in the printing part and in the non-printing part, simply based on the structured and the standardized metadata that is in the PDF. For instance, here, this is that was the file with processing steps. This was the extraction of the printed part, and that's the extraction of the die part. And again, if we have a look at the pit stop profile, you will see that we are not using colorant names or any ad hoc method, but we are using the structured metadata. So, for instance, if here we are selecting the layers, we select the cutting, we select all the, this is for making the printed part. So we select the all layers, we select the structural layers, and we saying don't select anything that is in the structural layers, and then we remove that selection, and we are what we have at the end of the day is only the objects that are in the structural layers, but based on the metadata. So far the demo summary, and then we'll open up for questions. With processing steps, the PDF becomes a single production master for printing and finishing. It uses optional content groups, also known as layers, as the selection mechanism, but it is compatible with previous methods using technical inks. It was developed in the Ghent workgroup with cooperation of industry partners, both vendors and users, and educational members. And it's now in the final stages of becoming an ISO standard, and the publication is expected in 2018. And that brings us to the end of this presentation and demo. I hope you found it interesting. And if there are any questions, now is the time to put them on the table, and we'll try to, Steve and I will try to answer them the best we can.
There is one question, Lieven, from Keith, who says, will Adobe Acrobat be able to generate the processing step PDF? That is really up to Adobe. Now, a couple of things to note is Callus, which is one of the vendors who has already announced support for the processing steps, is a integrated tool inside of Acrobat today. The pre-flighting engine that's inside of Acrobat is developed and maintained by Callus. So there's a good chance that Callus may introduce tools that will allow you to manipulate and or make processing steps, but that currently has not been announced. And I don't know, and Lieven, I don't know if you know of any specific announcements from Adobe or Callus about those tools into a production environment yet.
No, I can't. Just like you, I mean, we have to refer to Adobe for that.
So there's a question about in the legend, if the legend has extra colors in it, is it recommended to remove the unused CMYK? Because the legend is on a separate layer, Pete, it doesn't really matter because those tend to be ignored. Now, depending on the output tools that you're using, when you go to like make plates or whatever, it could affect that. But that's no different than a PDF today that has a legend with additional colors in it. So, to answer your question, if you want to be safe, yes, remove the unused CMYK colors, but it's not required. And again, how Lieven showed, depending on how sophisticated your pre-flighting tools are, is they can use these processing steps, different the OCGs or layers, to interact with the components that are only on the inside of the cutting to make decisions and processes further on down the line. And again, it can be done without human intervention. So the idea behind this is making sure your supply chain tools are smart enough to know what to do.
Yeah. So
and the second question you had, Pete, was about, are there any ink names that are tied to the processing steps? No, it's really about the OCGs. You could name the ink whatever you wanted to call it. It's really how they're assigned to the actual layers in the.
Yeah, and then for the inks, there is only the rule that in a processing, with the exception of legend, and legend is a bit of legend is a special case in the whole processing steps. Legend allows in the legend, all of the separations are allowed and all of the blend modes are allowed, but the specs says that your legend is not allowed to overlap with any of your printing content, so it has to be in the off-bleed area. The other processing steps have the non-interaction is guaranteed in the following way. You are not allowed to use an ink that is used for print content to color these processing steps. They have to be in blend mode normal, they have to be in overprint, and they have to be on top of the printing content. That's basically the rules.
So Lawrence, you asked the question, will this be part of PDF 2.1? The answer is processing steps does not utilize anything that is unique or new for the Acrobat specification, or the PDF specification, sorry. So processing steps will work on PDF 1.7 and above, or it also is compatible with the hopefully released sometime this year PDF 2.0 specification. So it does not require anything that's in PDF 2.0 to work. Everything that Lieven was showing you is based on, I believe, PDF 1.7, correct, Lieven?
Yeah, that's correct. So processing steps was deliberately designed to be orthogonal to any of the other PDF specifications, so it can work as long as the PDF version support layers. It's fine. So it can work on PDF 1.6.17, PDF X4, PDF 2. So it's independent of the base version.
There was also a question of whether we're aware of any printers that are following these specifications. I'm not specifically aware of anyone who's officially announced it. I know there's a lot looking at it. I think part of the challenge is that it's, to use an American term, it's a chicken and egg syndrome. which comes first? Is there a demand from the user base to have it, or is the vendors going to push it out to? So ESCO and the other ones that we announced in the slides have kind of been proactive in making tools that will interact and use these the new processing steps, so that I think we're going to see a lot more in 2018. There's a lot of other vendors who are members of the Gantt work group and also participate in the TC130 work group 2 ISO group that I believe we'll see more. But as of today, I don't know of anyone who's officially announced that they support and are endorsing this yet. We hope to change that quickly, but that's part of why we're doing the seminar.
Yeah, I think you have to realize it's early days. The standard is not officially published yet, and there are quite a bit of vendors that wait until something is published before actually starting implementations. Some companies like my own have started earlier because we trusted that the technical details and the spec were already fully stable and allowed to do implementations without the risk of having to redo stuff afterwards. But yeah, I think like Steve said, we will see larger adoption this year because it's really solving a hard real-world problem.
So Lawrence from AGFA also asked if the files that Lieven was showing are freely available. They are available. The Gantt work group on the packaging subcommittee site has a link to the files that were submitted to the ISO. So those files are there and available. They have the processing steps created based on the final disk that Lieven was talking about. So they are up to date. They have the layers there. They will not have some of the anomalies that Lieven introduced that he showed. They'll be cleaner, but they are available for you to use or test in your own workflows.
Yeah, the sample files that are publicly available are 100% in sync with the standard.
The only thing that, and you'll see this on the Gantt work group, but the only thing we ask is if you do use them, you don't modify the attributes of that they're property of the Gantt work group, et cetera, et cetera. You're freely to use them. You can use them in promotion. You can use them in testing. Just don't remove the Gantt work group logos or the phototype logos. Just that, because there's a lot of work that was put into those, and they are technically owned by both the ISO and Gantt work group, but they are not. There's no usage rights. You have permission to use them however you need to, just not to sell them.
Yeah, and they are already available from the Gantt work group site, but they will also be available as electronic inserts with the ISO specification. Okay, then I think it's time to thank you all for your attention and for attending this seminar. I hope you found it interesting, and if you have any more questions, you can always post them on the packaging subcommittee mail forum of the Gantt work group.